Well, thank you for coming today. My name is Jett. I'm the Vice President here at the FCC. Before we get started, just a couple of quick announcements. One, please be sure to silence your phones. And for those of you here today who are FCC members, a very important reminder that we have an election underway, and everyone who's a member should be sure to vote. The deadline is this Thursday at 3 p.m. If you don't have your ballot with you, ask the staff at the front desk if they can help you out with that, and hopefully you can get that done today while you're here. For those of you who are not members, a reminder that you are welcome to apply to the FCC at any time, and really the best time to join is now. On everyone's seat, you should have a copy of our excellent new membership brochure. Please give it to somebody, share it with a friend or someone who you think might be interested in joining. And just a reminder that if you successfully introduce a new member to the FCC, our incentive has recently doubled from $1,000 in F&B credit to $2,000 in F&B credit. So everybody wins, so be sure to spread the word. So for today, we are so pleased to have Kate Whitehead. Kate will be talking about her book, Pandemic Minds. Kate is an award-winning journalist and qualified psychotherapist based in Hong Kong. She is the author of 2 Hong Kong crime books, After Susie and Hong Kong Murders. Her most recent book, Pandemic Minds, is about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on mental health in Hong Kong. She's a longtime FCC member and previously served on the FCC board as a correspondent governor, and she was a winner of the Mind HK Media Awards for 2 consecutive years. So before we get started, just to get a sense of the room here, I just wanted to ask, how many of you were here for part or all of the pandemic here in Hong Kong? Pretty much everybody. And how many of you experienced some form of quarantine? Yeah, okay, a lot of trauma in the room here. So yeah, on that note, you know, it may be surprising to find how upsetting it can be to talk about these experiences. So if you do feel you're getting a bit overwhelmed, like, it's totally fine to just step out and come back when you're ready. But Kate, I just wanted to start by asking, how did this book come about, and why is it so important to make this happen?
On March the 1st last year, which was the day that we lifted the mask mandate in Hong Kong, I ran into the publisher for Hong Kong University Press, and he said to me, "Have you got any ideas for a psychology book?" And I just said yes immediately, even though I hadn't been thinking about a book. But I've been writing about mental health in the pandemic all the way through the pandemic. So it came together really quickly. Basically, within a week, I'd done a synopsis. By the middle of March, I was already doing my first interviews. And I did it fast. I basically wrote and researched the whole book in 6 months. So submitted it at the beginning of September.
It's record speed, and I'm sure it was appreciated by your publisher that you got it done so quickly.
Well, I just wanted to get the stories while they're fresh. Because as we know, it's like a year, just over a year on, and already everybody's looking at the pictures thinking, oh, that was ages ago, right? So I wanted to get those stories, because half the book is made up of first-person accounts of the pandemic. And I wanted to get those stories when people still remembered all the details of it.
So just jumping right into it, one of the biggest issues people faced during the pandemic was isolation. Whether that was in quarantine or just socially not going out, not going to school, not going to work. Can you talk about the impact that kind of isolation has on people, and particularly older people?
So we humans, we basically want to have social engagement. Oh, can you hear me? Am I a bit echoey? Yeah, better. We humans, we basically need to be with other humans to regulate our emotions, and it makes us feel safe when we are with other humans. So when we feel lonely, when we feel isolated, that basically just compounds stress. So the self-distancing regulations that were in place were just basically designed to make us isolated, right? So isolation was a huge problem, especially in elderly care homes, because of course the elderly care homes, lots of the elderly, they already live alone, and then they were either living in elderly old people's homes or they were living at home. And a lot of those services, so a lot of the elderly care homes, they stopped having visitors, and the services that they would get, basically like Meals on Wheels, deliveries, a lot of those stopped as well. The public libraries closed, swimming pools closed, you could only have 2 people go to a restaurant. All those things cut out the kind of social and emotional engagement that they would usually have to help them regulate their emotions. So it was especially challenging for elderly people. But also the quarantine, all of us at that show of hands, pretty much everybody did quarantine, so everybody experienced that kind of isolation too. And studies show that 2 or 3 days of isolation and quarantine is okay, but it's once you hit the 1-week mark, that's when you start seeing the kind of adverse mental health effects, everything from kind of like low mood to irritability, all the way up the spectrum to PTSD. And many of us were doing a 3-week quarantine, right? Which is, if you have good mental health and you go in for a 3-week quarantine, already that's quite challenging. But if you are coming in off the back of a challenging life event, somebody has died, someone close to you has died, or you've just gone through a divorce, and then you are face 3 weeks of isolation without being able to talk to people, be able to emotionally regulate with other people, that made it really challenging for a lot of people.
So suddenly we were all thrown into this situation that was very challenging for our mental health. And for all the many rules and regulations that the government was issuing, it didn't seem like mental health was really much of a consideration. Can you talk about some of the barriers to mental health care that people faced during the pandemic, especially frontline workers and pilots?
Well, the frontline medical workers, the doctors and nurses and the pilots especially, they were under huge psychological pressure, the sort of kind of psychological pressure that can lead to PTSD, right? And consider that, and then consider the fact that that kind of pressure is going to impair their ability to do their work safely. And we're talking about pilots and people working in hospitals. And then you add on to the fact that it was actually difficult for them to get mental health support. And it's clear that that is not a healthy system. Looking at the pilots were in that closed loop system. So for 6 weeks at a time, they were basically going from the plane, landing in an airport, and then they would basically go to a hotel. Then from the hotel, they would basically go back to the plane, shuttling back and forth like that, not seeing their family and friends for 6 weeks at a time, right? And these are men and women who are trained to deal with stress and trained to be able to think in highly stressful emergency situations. But it's the accumulative effect of that, right? There were people in there who 18 months of closed loop systems, they did 200 plus days of quarantine, right? And then the onus is put on the pilots to declare if they are unfit for work, right? Which is a really difficult situation because they were worried about basically going to an aviation psychologist and saying, I'm struggling, because they were concerned that they might be struck off the list. They wouldn't get that medical certification that they need. And if you get struck off, there was no clear message about, well, would you be able to get back on the list again, right? So would that be the end of their career? And that's why at the end of 2022, okay, there were other reasons too, but it was a key reason why at the end of 2022, so many Hong Kong-based pilots left Hong Kong. And the same with the frontline medical workers and the doctors and nurses. They are trained to deal with illness and death, but they were under huge psychological pressure, right? They were worried about getting the virus. They were worried about bringing the virus back home. There was a shortage of PPE. They were working long hours. All of these things add on to be a huge stress. And everybody says, of course, yes, it's great, get mental health support. Hospitals actually had mental health support available, but very few people took it up because there was a huge stigma about putting your hand up and actually taking it and being seen to take it, and worries, just like with the pilots, like, is this going to affect my future career?
One of the quotes that struck me from the book was from a migrant worker who said she thinks, quote, people's mental health is getting worse after COVID. During COVID, we were just going and going. We were in fight or flight mode, and we kept fighting. Then when the body is able to rest, it goes boom. Last year, for example, there was a a concern over a spate of stabbings that appeared to be linked to mental illness. Do you agree that Hong Kong's mental health is getting worse, and why would it be getting worse now when the pandemic is over?
Absolutely, it's getting worse. And this is no surprise. This was predicted all the way through the pandemic. The mental health professionals kept saying, we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg, just wait until it stops, and then we'll really see the impact. And that's exactly what has happened. All the stats that are coming out showing depression levels are really high. I think it's one in four children and adolescents at the end of last year experienced moderate to severe depression. Suicide rate has escalated. And I mean, it's the same all around the world, but Hong Kong is especially high. And you might think, oh, well, the pandemic's ended, so why are we seeing all these effects? But I mean, young people are the ones who've been particularly impacted, because when we had the school closures and the online learning, it wasn't just about learning on a screen. It was the whole structure of their day was impacted, right? So they basically started developing bad habits, lots of time, lots of screen time, not sleeping so well, not eating so well, and all that kind of social support network with their peers, that all went out the window. So young people have really struggled. And then for adults, a lot of adults are post-pandemic are experiencing financial stress. And then a lot of people who already had mental health issues, who were just managing to get by in the pandemic, a lot of their support was cut off during the pandemic. And so now we're seeing the effects of them not having had support for those 3 years.
And on a related note, how well has Hong Kong helped people address mental health issues they may be experiencing as a result of the pandemic?
Moves have been made, which is good. It's definitely steps have been made in the right direction, but it's just nowhere near enough. We've got a great contingent from Mind Hong Kong here, who I'm sure can speak to that. But there was basically, it was in June last year, the Advisory Committee on Mental Health came up with 10 strategies of what to do. And I think about 3 of them have made inroads, all to do with basically trying to reduce waiting times for mental health and setting up community-led initiatives. But the kind of really big one, which was a high-level coordinating body to kind of oversee mental health in Hong Kong, that hasn't happened, right? So a lot more still needs to be done.
There's a chapter in the book about uncertainty and the harm that chronic worrying and not knowing what's going to happen can do to our mental health. Can you talk about how that manifested during the pandemic? And also, the end of the pandemic certainly doesn't mean the end of uncertainty in our lives. So how can we mitigate against that uncertainty, both during pandemics and in quote-unquote normal times?
So we humans, we are hardwired to want certainty. It makes us feel good. It makes us feel safe. And when we don't have certainty, the future's uncertain, we experience a range of emotions, from feeling uncomfortable all the way up to feeling overwhelmed, right? And that can actually sometimes magnify problems or even paralyze us so that we can't do anything. And just because the pandemic has ended, uncertainty is a feature that all of us are going to experience in our lives for one reason or another. So the key sort of takeaway, I think, that many of us learned during the pandemic is that there is always going to be uncertainty. So you've just got to accept, first of all, look at the situation and go, well, there are certain things that I can't change, and I'm just going to have to accept them. Certain things are out of my control. You look at what those things are, and then you just accept that that is the situation. And then you look at, what are the things that I can change, right? And you focus on changing those. And if you focus on things that support your mental and physical health, eating better, exercising, connecting with family and friends, all those kind of things, those are the kind of things that are actually going to stand you in good stead to deal with an uncertain situation. So there are things you can do in times of uncertainty, and it makes you feel good when you're actually doing something.
So you've been a journalist for a long time, and I think it was a few years ago you trained to become a psychotherapist. When you were conducting the interviews for this book, did you feel your role was more as a journalist or a psychotherapist, and how do those two roles complement each other?
Absolutely, I was doing both. So I was the journalist in terms of going out, using my network to reach out and just try and find people to interview and setting all that up. That was all journalism. But the interviews, there was a lot of therapy skills involved in that. I just mean therapy skills in terms of just listening, right? Really non-judgmentally listening and validating people's experience. Because a lot of the people that I was speaking to, this was the first time they had shared their experience. And if you've never had a mental health issue before, which a lot of the people who I spoke to for the book have never had one, it's difficult to articulate it, and it's very scary. But it can be so empowering to basically say your story, share your story, and have it validated, especially have it in a book and have other people read it and say, oh, wow, that was really tough for you. Even if a lot of the people have used pseudonyms, right? But being acknowledged is really big. One of the pilots that I interviewed, so Aaron Bush, who's an FCC member, who a lot of people probably know as Trip Ahead, he basically reached out to his people on Twitter or X and said that I was looking for people to interview, and this pilot came forward. And I spoke to him on the phone. We didn't actually meet. He used a pseudonym, but we spent a few hours talking, and he messaged me afterwards and said that basically that process of sharing what had happened, he was caught in that closed loop system we were just talking about, and he just got married. He was from Malaysia, but based in Hong Kong. He just got married before the pandemic and stuck in that closed loop system, really missing his wife, really missing family, really struggling, afraid of getting mental health support because of the stigma and what that might mean for his career. But he said sharing his story just gave him the confidence to basically go and get counseling. And then he did. And he messaged me afterwards and said he really, really helped. And in fact, I spoke to him last week because I told him the book's coming out, and he's in a really good place now. So sharing your story can actually be therapeutic and quite empowering. So the people who shared their stories, basically everybody shared their stories. They chose to, right? So it's good to share your story, to read it. And I think when people read the book, if you identify with an element in a story, it just makes you feel like, okay, I'm not alone, right? And then that might empower you to share your story with someone else. And these kind of sharing of stories and talking about it, that is what breaks down stigma.
On a related note, I was struck by how many people in the book didn't use their real names. And I know the point is the story, not the identity of the person. But can you talk a bit about why people might have been so reluctant to have their real names associated with these stories?
Talking about mental health is a very sensitive subject, right? And a lot, like we were just talking, a lot of people are concerned that will it reflect on their job prospects or how they are judged. So I said to people at the outset, there's no pressure at all. If you want to use your full name, do. If you just want to use your first name, do. If you want to use a pseudonym, I'm really not bothered what you choose. My main thing is I want you to feel comfortable enough to speak really honestly and authentically. Because the real value in the stories is the fact that they are real stories and people are being very honest. That counts a lot more than attaching a name to it.
Reading the book, I've been thinking about the pandemic a lot. And it just feels so crazy to me that we live through under these extreme restrictions and endured experiences that we never could have imagined. And it wasn't really that long ago. Like you said, it was only March 1st of last year when we stopped wearing masks everywhere. And it doesn't feel like we ever really got a chance to process what happened and what we went through. And today, at least for me, like we don't really talk about it or even think about it that much because life is just moving very fast again, and it doesn't seem like there's any time. Is there a psychological explanation for that kind of behavior and not addressing what happened, and what are the potential consequences of that?
It's human nature that after something like that, we just want to power on, move on. We want normalcy. Normalcy makes us feel safe. Let's just get back to life before the pandemic. And there's also a degree of avoidance, right? Let's not talk about that. It's over with. Let's just get on with it. But avoiding things is never a good idea because they just stack up underneath, right? So it's always good to address things because they will build up if you don't. But we're kind of missing a trick if we don't just take a moment, like just being here this afternoon for like 40 minutes, just taking a moment to just kind of reflect and just I'm sure you're all thinking of, like, as we speak, of what experience you had during the pandemic. And that kind of moment of just taking a moment to pause and reflect, you kind of helps you to process what you went through, and also it helps us to kind of think about the future, because I don't know if you saw the SCMP today, but there was a big story in there talking about the next pandemic. China's already planning for that, right? So if we're planning for when there's going to be another pandemic, and it's on the cards, it's not a matter of if, it's when. Let's learn from what happened, right? And the end of the book, actually, there's strategies which are basically taken from everybody I spoke to. I just kind of thought about each person, and I thought, what have they said that they think will be better? What should we do next time differently? And I just drew all their insights together to make a suggestion of how we could do things better. Because if we don't, we're missing a trick, right? We're just going to repeat it. In fact, when I was doing the research, I was looking back on papers from SARS 20 years ago. And at the end of SARS, which of course was much shorter, but they were saying, oh, next time we should do this, this, and this. And it wasn't done. And if it had been done, then COVID would have been a lot easier in Hong Kong. So we really need to learn from this pandemic to make the next one less stressful.
Toward the end of the book, you talk about possible silver linings from Hong Kong's pandemic experience, including in the area of mental health. To what extent has Hong Kong's experience during the pandemic opened up space for discussion about mental health that maybe wasn't there before?
Absolutely. I mean, we're here. I'm sure many people here wouldn't have come to a talk about mental health 5 or 10 years ago, right? We are so much more comfortable speaking about mental health. I qualified as a therapist just before the pandemic started, and so it just seemed natural that I would start writing about mental health. But if I qualified, I think, 10 years ago, I don't think the health editor would have wanted to take so many mental health stories. But as it was, every time I pitched a story on mental health, it was accepted. There was this huge thirst to basically talk about mental health, because so many of us, whether it was us personally or someone close to us, was going through something. So I think it's a silver lining that we talk about it now.
And what's something that surprised you in the course of researching this book or conducting the interviews?
A couple of things. There was one, I interviewed Laura Hazlitt. She used her full name. So Laura Hazlitt was in the news at the time because she was separated from her 11-month-old daughter. So she's in the chapter on child separation. And I interviewed her quite early on in the research. And of course, it was super traumatic, right? She was separated from her baby. And then a couple of months later, I interviewed a pediatrician, and she spoke about how she really struggled during the pandemic, because she described it as, usually they have a room which has one cot for a child, and they have a chair next to it where the parent can stay. That's their usual setup. During the pandemic, they were just overwhelmed and under-resourced. So that room, they took the chair out, and they had 4 cots in there. So in order to reach the child in the corner, they had to move the other cots around. There was no way that you could get 4 parents in there as well. She just said they were struggling just to look after the basic needs of the children they had, let alone spend time talking to the parents. So hearing both their stories alongside each other, it just made you realize that everybody was struggling in the pandemic, right? And I think that's the value of kind of hearing people's stories, is you see the other side. On the one side, it seemed really unfair that the hospitals weren't caring for these parents and their babies, but then you see what the doctors are going through too. Yeah. And another surprise is I interviewed a man who was made homeless during the pandemic. He was a mechanic, and he would basically drive through the Cross Harbour Tunnel, and if your car gets stuck in the Cross Harbour Tunnel, he was part of the team that would basically fix it and quickly get out of the tunnel. And during the pandemic, 2 of his colleagues who were on the same team got COVID and died. They were in their 30s, and that really upset him and stressed him, and he quit his job. And because he quit his job, he couldn't get another job. It was a pandemic, so he couldn't pay his rent, so he became homeless. So he ended up living on the rooftop of his building for 6, 7, 8 months in all weathers, under a black kind of tarpaulin. And then eventually somebody complained about him, and he was kicked off the roof even, which actually turned out to be a blessing, because he was picked up by Impact HK, the homeless charity, and he started working for the homeless charity. I'm going to get to the surprise bit in a minute. He started working for the homeless charity, and he was living in a dorm room, and he got COVID off somebody in the dorm with him. So he was sent to Penny's Bay. Penny's Bay, which everybody was traumatized even thinking about going, and had grab bags by the door, and we were all discussing what we should do. It was what we were more afraid of going to Penny's Bay, many of us, than even getting COVID. I remember saying that at the time. And I asked him what it was like, and he said, fantastic. I had my own room, I just watched movies, I just pressed a button and they brought me noodles, had a great time. So it's just kind of made me realize that everybody experiences trauma in a different way. What might be traumatic for one person isn't necessarily traumatic for another person.
I want to open it up to questions. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, Greg Dieb. Thank you very much, Kate. I think it's great to see these books being produced. Some comments and some questions. The first one, we keep on referring to the pandemic did this. It wasn't the pandemic. It was the pandemic regulations that did this. And I think it's important if we all begin to make that distinction and realize that COVID didn't do this. We did it to ourselves, and we allowed these regulations to happen. So it's a really, really important point. Second one, very early on in the pandemic, my wife and I became very, very involved in different medical institutions around the world. Things like the Great Barrington Declaration, things like the FLCCC. And this one's a little bit of a criticism of the FCC, if you don't mind. We tried in around about July, mid-2020, to get these organizations to be represented here at the FCC with using a kind of Zoom call and conferences like this. We thought it very important because on the one hand, they were covering things that would have actually worked against the regulations that caused all this mental health. So the Great Barrington Declaration, for example, was all about protecting those in need and allowing the rest of society to continue who were at very low risk from this disease. The other one was the FLCCC that had come up with a number of repurposed drugs very early on in the pandemic that were highly effective. When we tried to introduce those connections to the FCC, which we thought was really critical for journalists here to pick it up, Keith Riesberg at that time shot it down. And we tried multiple occasions through Tim Huxley, through Keith, and it just continually wasn't palatable. So I think to a degree we have to take responsibility ourselves for, in a sense, allowing these regulations to take place. And the last part of it is just the mental health aspect is so critically important. And I think this is really, really great to see so many people here and have a book produced. The one thing that is totally ignored is vaccine adverse events. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands of people in Hong Kong alone who are operating under the radar in Hong Kong. The only people they can go to is their trusted GP because most GPs will not touch it with a barge pole. Government has a whole lot of regulations that they require for people to report this, and if it's not on their regulation list, which only accounts for 10 or 20 different adverse reactions, they refuse to even acknowledge they exist. So those people who went forward, who are not anti-vaccine because they got a vaccine and that's how they got injured, those people are running around with this, number one, physical anguish, but also this mental anguish of being completely sidelined and now being categorized as anti-vaccine simply because they want to report something that physically went wrong with them. So I'd like to hear your views on those, but know that I'm asking this with full support for you.
To answer all three of your, speak to all three of your points is probably, we won't have enough time for that, but just to address the first one where it sounded like, just to say that I have not made this a political book because, and I haven't even mentioned zero COVID in it, right? Because I didn't see value in making it into a political book. It would just be shot down if it was. And that's like basically missing out on the opportunity to have a healing conversation, right? next time the pandemic comes around, changing the regulations and things like that, that's, I was talking about uncertainty and what you can control. We can't control the regulations, right? But we can control other things. And so we can control how we react within that framework. We can make things better. So basically, this book is speaking to that. This book is not about talking about vaccines, criticizing government. It's basically saying, within this model, this is what happened. This is how we responded, and this is how we could respond next time in a similar situation, which will be more productive.
Yes.
No, sorry, I haven't read your book. Fascinating topic. Glad you've produced it. Can you talk about the children, the impact on the kids that went to school, various different ages, the young ones who didn't get that the emotional bonding that they might have had at school when they were very young, the teenagers, etc. Just breaking it through the different impacts kids may have had. And still have because of what happened.
Sorry, the question?
The impact on
children.
Yeah, I mean, huge. So there's a whole chapter in the book about school closures and the impact it had, exactly as you just laid out, starting from very young children all the way up, depending on different ages, different levels of social development. But it affected all children, but in different ways. I interviewed one child, and he was 2 at the start of the pandemic, right? So 5 going on 6 at the end of it, and he wore a mask all the way through it. And all the way through the pandemic, he had been going to a speech therapist because he had difficulties with speech. And I spoke to his mother and I spoke to him, and she said, he's still struggling with his speech. He's still struggling with his speech. And then it turned out that when he goes for these lessons with the speech therapist wears a mask. The whole point is that you can see the mouth. Even now, so I was speaking to her after the mask mandate was lifted, and the mother kind of acknowledged it wasn't helpful. She said early on that speech therapist had worn one of those plastic masks where you could see, but the child found it scary. It is a little bit scary when you see someone's mouth moving behind the plastic. But the mother, even though the mask mandate had ended, this therapist, for the safety of her own child back home, was wearing a mask. So, I mean, I could go on about the different challenges. There's an excuse to buy the book. You'll read the rest.
Other questions? Yes, Lee.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate. Hi, I'm Lee Williamson, SAMP and current president of the club. Fully cognizant that you said that you didn't intend to write a political book, one of the things that did jump out at me was, if I heard you right, you talked about how uncertainty can cause mental health problems and sudden change. Now, the COVID-19 restrictions weren't the only quite sudden change in society we experienced over those years. While I appreciate that the book isn't about that, I'm wondering if you can share with this audience any learnings that you came across through your interviews with regards to how the change in Hong Kong politics and society may have had an impact on mental health in the city.
Absolutely, and I say this in the book, coming off the back of a year of social unrest and protests, and then we were straight into the pandemic. We had 4 really, really tough years. So, and I do talk about that in the book, about the impact that had. It just aggravated the mental health situation in Hong Kong, definitely. I mean, at the moment, 18 to 24-year-olds in Hong Kong, there is 44% of them, this is the most recent data, 44% of them have moderate to severe depression. It's the highest age group in Hong Kong with mental health issues. That's the group that was a bit more active during the protests, right? So definitely, it's made it even more challenging. Yeah, but I don't want to speak too directly to the protests and COVID measures.
Yes.
Hi, Kate. Thanks for the great talk. When you interview the people, I'm just interested, were they mostly expats or local people or a mix? And is there any difference to how people were affected by the pandemic, depending if they were expats or local?
Thank you for asking that, because I worked so hard to try to get a really diverse group of people, because mental health affects everybody. We discovered that during the pandemic, right? So I really wanted to show everybody from the homeless right up to CEOs. And I've got men and women. The majority of people are Hong Kong Chinese because that reflects the Hong Kong population. But I've also spoke to 8 other nationalities, different ages, different walks of life, and to show that everybody experiences challenges, but the more vulnerable working class, women, migrant communities, because they aren't as well resourced, so the challenges are greater for them, right? I mean, seeking mental health support, somebody who's very wealthy can just go and afford to pay for it because mental health is very expensive in Hong Kong. Whereas if you are working class, the homeless man that I just told you about, he lost his job, the mechanic, he went to a government facility. He'd never experienced a mental health issue before. When he was living on the rooftop, he was feeling suicidal and living on a rooftop. He was very worried. He'd never felt like this. So he went to a government clinic. Of course, they're overwhelmed. They've got long waiting lists. The nurse says to him, "Oh, you look okay." He's like this 35-year-old guy, reasonably good looking, you look okay. Yeah, well, maybe he looks okay, but it's what's going on inside of his head, right? And there wasn't that support, wasn't available, right? So definitely the more vulnerable groups and the people with less money, it hits them harder, but the impact actually hit everybody.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you for the talk. Thank you for the talk. I haven't read the book either, but I'm going to, I think. It is a bit traumatizing, actually, sitting here, hearing about it. I'm not sure if a lot of people feel this way. I didn't think I would, but as you mentioned at the beginning, it was actually surprising. I find that I did forget a lot about the details that you mentioned. 2 people per table. There were, even during the pandemic, when our pets, my wife and I, our pets died, only one of us can go in to watch the pets. So that's really difficult. I guess my question is this, as you were writing the book, you must have heard so many stories. It must have been difficult for you to hear some of them. What was it like for you writing the book? And how did you deal with some of those emotions?
Thank you for asking. That's very kind. Before I say how I felt, I just want to say that I'm sorry you're feeling a bit traumatized by it, and that at the end of every chapter, so I've deliberately designed the book, I don't want to just traumatize people. The idea of collecting the stories was that so we have a record of it and so we can process, and at the end of every chapter I've included coping strategies. And they're simple strategies, but they are effective, and they are just a way of looking after ourselves when we're in tough times. So I hope you do buy the book, you can see that. But as for myself, so everybody, March 1, masks come off, everybody races off, end of the pandemic, except for me. I'm like, tell me all your pandemic stories. And so 4 months into it, I just started to feel quite overwhelmed myself by all these stories. So I was just reliving the pandemic myself. At the end of the book, there were 2, I think of them as, well, there's 3 happy chapters. And one of the happy chapters is about nature and the wonderful resource of hiking and being out in nature. And the other happy chapter is called Silver Linings, because good things did happen during the pandemic, right? And finding moments of happiness in a bleak situation doesn't negate the grief or the fear, whatever we're going through, right? So 4 months into it, it took me 6 months to write the book, so 4 months into it, I just jumped ahead. And I wrote those 2 chapters because I just thought, I need to hear some happy stories, I need some positiveness. So if when you're reading the book, you don't have to read it in chronological order, and if you start reading it and you think, oh, it's getting a bit bleak, jump to the happy chapters towards the end. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm Kathy Shannon. Thank you so much, Kate, for your great work. I haven't finished the book. I just finished 2 chapters until quarantine. And being a communication consultant, maybe make me sensitive to 3 words that mentioned frequently in chapter 2 concerning quarantine is lack of communication. So I'm not sure whether you have touched about communication in other chapters, but somehow What is your idea? What is your opinion that how should Hong Kong do better in the communication aspect to prevent us to go through the same sufferings if another pandemic will come again? That's question number one. And question number two is for FCC. So since for the communication aspect is a really big thing, so is it worthwhile or will FCC to consider, say in the future, to gather people together, especially people working in the communication field, and to come together, put our heads together and think something about to help Hong Kong to get ourselves more ready? Because the pity is the Singaporean government dare to do its own review, even though it's, of course, must be biased. But anyhow, it has the guts to do the review and to tell the people what has the government do well and what has the government do badly. But somehow our government denied to do so. And so there's nothing being discussed after this big disaster. So we didn't have a solid ground for us to really to think and to get ourselves better prepared for the next pandemic to come.
Okay, I'll take the communication one. I'm glad you said that, because right at the end of the book, when I say the ways forward, communication is one of the things that we can improve. Yes, so jump ahead and read that section. I mentioned Aaron Bush, who ran the Trip Ahead program. So he became very big on Twitter during the pandemic because he was basically getting all the government information and consolidating it and making it into bite-sized pieces that people could understand, right? Because the government was churning out loads of information and loads of data, but it just wasn't easy to understand. So next pandemic, we could have someone like Aaron, but doing it from the government point of view and sending it out so much clearer information. And another suggestion that came out through the research of the book is speaking to a lot of parents and doctors and nurses in hospitals. They were really confused, right? Because the government kept updating the regulations, but one hospital would read one thing. Even within the same hospital, doctors and nurses were hearing different things. And I know that you guys in the old people's care home sector as well weren't getting clear information. So come the next pandemic, we have one platform where it's really clear and everyone can go there, right? And when it's updated, everybody just looks at that one platform rather than hospitals being sent stuff and people looking on different websites, and it just gets very confusing. We just have like one go-to, one-stop shop. The update is just here and nice and simple, no fancy jargon. That's how we can improve it next time.
To answer the FCC question, I think that's a great idea and something that we should explore. Even if there isn't a formal government review, that doesn't mean it has to stop other people from coming up with their own initiatives and how to prepare better, whether it's communications professionals or any other group of people with knowledge and expertise that they can contribute. So yeah, I think we should talk about it.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Jackie. I've got a two-pronged question for you. One is about perhaps your future book, if you're going to write another one, which would perhaps look at how other countries did it differently. And I'm really interested in how families, or if you came across families that were split between different countries. So, for example, I'm 34 years living here, but I spent 2 years in Scotland during COVID because my two boys were at university and I didn't want to leave them alone because they were chucked out. And husband was in Tokyo and couldn't get out of Tokyo because he couldn't get in or out. So we were all in different countries. And in the UK, as you probably know, it was like no shops open, no restaurants open. We definitely think we were more hard done by than what Charlie was in Tokyo or what Mabel or anybody was in Hong Kong, because you guys were still going to restaurants even although you had limited numbers. In the UK, it literally was closed shop. And so I'm just wondering if you came across different views and things between families, because we certainly all have them in our little family unit of 4. We all feel how hard done. The one that started university wasn't allowed to go to university, didn't meet any of his tutors for 3 years, basically. And the one that was in his final year was in China, got kicked out of China and ended up in Scotland and finished it in his bedroom. And then retirement year was in Tokyo, so couldn't get out of Tokyo. And then I basically gave up work here and went off to look after them. I think it's all diverse. I think everybody handled things very differently, and I wondered if you'd come across any of that.
And isn't it amazing when I hear you say all that? That's such a tough thing to go through, right? And yet you and your family managed to do it, but it was really tough. I haven't included an example of that in the book, but I did do a newspaper story speaking to expats who were in Hong Kong and who had one partner in one place and kids in different places, and how they managed to negotiate all the different regulations. So they'd have chat groups where, you know, what does it mean if I'm in Belgium? What does that mean if I'm in London or in Hong Kong? And constantly changing regulations of what COVID test do you need, and all those kind of complicated things of being a very international family. Yeah. So there's not a story like that in the book, but I have covered it.
Other questions? Well, one question I wanted to ask, there's a chapter in the book about hiking and the healing power of nature. And for those of you who don't know, Kate is a highly experienced, amazing hiker, and found yourself with a lot of company on the trails suddenly during the pandemic because everybody was hiking. Can you just talk about sort of how that benefited people and the role that nature plays?
Well, I don't need, everybody in this room knows what great nature we have in Hong Kong, and I'm sure most people here do the trails themselves. In SARS, we saw a spike of people using the trails, and in the pandemic, there was another massive spike, right? Because the gyms were closed, the pools were closed, you know, it was a free resource that everyone could enjoy. I did that round the island hike twice during the pandemic because I'd just done all the normal trails, and there is so much research that shows that being out in nature is great. Of course, if you're hiking, you get the endorphins and the exercise is really good, but just being in nature is good, right? It boosts our mood, it lowers stress. The Japanese have a thing called Shinrin-juku, which is called forest bathing, where you just immerse yourself in the forest using your 5 senses, and that has been shown to lower cortisol levels. So yeah, being in nature, I was like, I definitely want some happy chapters, and I decided to give that a whole happy chapter to nature, because I think we're so lucky in Hong Kong to have that, and so many of us used it as a resource during the pandemic.
Any other questions?
Yeah, one more.
Yes.
Concerning the copies of the book, because we bought the last 2 last week. So is there any new stocks in the
Yes.
FCC that we
Yes,
can buy?
please.
More?
Thank you for the question.
Excellent question. There's a table over here with a whole pile of books available for sale, and Kate is here to sign them. And I have to say, having read this myself, it's really a wonderful book. I got a lot out of it. As you said, it does help to hear other people's stories and remind yourself that we all went through this together. We might have experienced it in different ways, but it's something that we all share and something that we can all learn from, I think. Was there anything you wanted to add?
Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. Thanks.